This is The Hypothesis, the show where industry experts debate and discuss growth marketing approaches, digital advertising tactics, measurement plans, as well as creative and growth strategies.
Hi, I'm Phil Ware, VP of Strategy at Thrive Digital.
And I'm Eric Sloan, VP of Data and Strategy at Thrive Digital.
And I'm your moderator, lay marketer, and asker of clarifying questions, Santana Blanchett. So friends, today is part 2 of our budget episode. So what we know for sure is that boom and bust is inevitable in business, but especially it's felt in marketing. And so getting more from less is asked from us often, and especially like in-house marketing teams as well. So how do you reduce your spend wisely to maintain as much of your results as possible? Today's hypothesis is that you're making budget cuts worse than they need to be. So, in a perfect world where we have control over our budgets, when are some valid reasons or places to cut marketing spend? Like, let's say it's not the CFO coming to us, it's us saying we're overspending. Why would be some valid reasons that we would cut marketing spend as marketers?
My initial take on this is marketers should always be thinking about how can I reduce my spend and delivering the same results. It's less of a thought exercise that you do when the time comes up because someone might be poking around the results within the company or an external agency. You need to be thinking about that all the time. As you go through every kind of QBR that you do as a business, think about where are the areas that I'm overinvested in right now that are up for debate, and be really thinking about that as an always on mindset around where could you be redistributing budget that is maybe not performing for you the way it could be and delivering the most value. So in a nutshell, that's kind of my perspective, that there are always valid reasons to cut budget and should be being discussed frequently and not just be a reaction to broader market forces around the economy or product market fit or whatever it may be. You should always be thinking about that specific topic.
The reason why I love that so much is because the more scenario planning you do around your marketing program, the better you get an intuition for how, like, the dynamics of all of the various different pieces of that marketing program. And so understanding sort of what would happen if you would cut a particular channel, how that would affect your organic traffic, how it would affect your direct traffic, how it would affect, of course, sales, all of those things, and just getting a sort of feel for that. But the reason why I love your statement there, Phil, about just always thinking about it is that forces marketing teams to be sort of tinkering with the levers that they can pull for their marketing program all the time, right? And so we should be trying to, increase or decrease budget in particular channels on a regular basis to try to understand the dynamics of that channel. We should be, of course, in an always testing mindset about, new or different creative, but also different offers and different ways of generating a response in the business, right? Because when you cut budget, maybe you still have in fact, probably you still have, the same target to hit in terms of revenue or something like that. And so just, knowing your program at a deeper level is going to give you the intuition and the tools to sort of make better decisions when you do have to cut budget.
Yeah, it's almost like you're prepared for it, and that you've done the homework and due diligence before there is a kind of like forced decision, a reaction to the market condition. It's kind of like, well, I've done my homework. We just go through the checklist versus a panicked response where you say, well, I'm going to cut all the top of funnel stuff because it's not performing for me on a ROAS level. And
Right.
There's a very kind of like clear process that you go through then, and methodology versus panicking, because we know people don't make great decisions when they're panicking. It needs to be kind of well thought through and prepared for.
Yeah.
The one thing I would say though is, like, obviously we're talking about channels and where ad spend goes from a distribution perspective, but there's also kind of tooling. There is a lot of spend that marketing teams put into tools to help them with their analyses or with market research or whatever it may be. We're probably not going to dive too much into that today, but there are a lot of conversations around that as well. It's a kind of a holistic approach that marketing teams should take, not just of where can I redistribute my budget from a channel perspective, but also all of these other kind of inputs that go into a great marketing program, be that people, be that tools, be that creative, like all those things should be kind of always up for debate and thinking around a bottoms up approach when you're doing a budget every single year.
I'm also curious, Phil, like what do you see is the most common reaction in your experience? Because I think what I've seen a lot is kind of one of two scenarios. I suppose I'm putting this both in the bucket of maybe not an ideal way to reduce budget. I see commonly a sort of even approach, and so you take a look at the advertising program and you say, hey, we need to cut budget by 30%, so we're just going to shave 30% off of every channel, and that's of course problematic in a number of ways, but the primary way is just that each of those channels has a different saturation rate, right? And so like you can't do that and expect to have the same result just reduced by 30%. It causes all sorts of issues with the advertising program. The other one that I see though is let's cut all of our sort of top of funnel or anything that kind of is not performing in a short-term capacity, right? And so let's just focus on the bottom of funnel. We need to make deep cuts to the marketing program, and so you end up focusing on things like search advertising, things like retargeting, social retargeting, those types of things, and it really just focuses on existing customers and not growth, right? And that's of course hugely problematic because you almost make the problem worse. Like if that budget cut was coming down from your finance team because you were missing the quarter or something like that, making a change to the advertising program like that is only going to make things worse, right? So I'm curious what you've seen, if that's been your experience as well.
It's two valid kind of responses that I've seen multiple times in my career. One of the things that I would say is somewhat more common is the latter example you shared, where there is this need to drive performance through the marketing program, and any of those harder to measure channels or tactics that are generally higher up the funnel because they don't produce, ROAS, quote unquote. It's very easy for a finance team to come in and be like, great, these aren't working, let's cut these. But that's very short-sighted in my opinion. What that does, especially if we're having a down quarter, all you're doing is setting yourself up for next quarter to be a slow one too by doing so, because you are not filling your user journey or user pipeline with users discovering your product and really understanding what your product offering is. So in a kind of like a perfect world, you obviously wouldn't want to cut anywhere across the funnel, but we're in a situation where we do need to cut. So one of the things that I would recommend, and like what I've kind of worked on in the past, is this kind of bottoms up approach to budget reduction. So rather than starting at the top and going down with like, where can we cut budgets? You start from the bottom up and think about, well, what is the true value of each of those tactics we're doing? So for example, like branded search is around about as bottom of funnel as you can get. Is that really driving that much value? And is it working effectively for us? If that's not, cut the budget by 50%, see what happens. Cut the budget by 100% and see what happens in an incrementality testing scenario. And try to get that understanding of how truly incremental that channel is, and then start reducing the budget that way so you can keep the pipeline full of users and trying to reach out to those people that are really driving that long-term value for the business. There's also other channels too, right? Like we're talking a lot about paid, but there's also email, there's SMS, there's organic, that are all a part of that ecosystem that also shouldn't be forgotten. So, email, it's somewhat cheaper to go out and try and use that as a way to keep users engaged with your brand versus going out and putting retargeting ads or retention ads out for those users. So I think there's a viewpoint that needs to be taken across all those different channels that drive growth versus just the paid elements of the program. I'm curious, Eric, how would you approach the kind of budget reduction scenario, and how would you go and say we need to reduce the budget by 30% this quarter? How would you go through trying to pick which channel, given that a top-down approach maybe isn't the best, an even approach isn't the best? What's your perspective?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with you. I think that the bottom up approach is a good way to approach it. I think from my perspective, I would agree that bottom of funnel is usually where you can find opportunities where things are not performing as well as maybe you think they are. But then, I guess I might flip this back at you. Because I think marketing teams are going to run into incentive problems. Because if you start cutting at the bottom of funnel, that's where your attribution reports are basically getting all of your return on ad spend. And so if you're running into this problem where finance is saying, hey, you need to cut budget, but we still need to hit a target, or we still need to hit this like return on ad spend target, you're going to run into a wall because
Right.
all of the return on ad spend in all of your reporting is actually coming from the bottom of the funnel, right? And so
Right.
it becomes this really tricky sort of balancing act almost. And I think that the worst spot that you can be in, I think, is probably marketing teams where they haven't educated the executive team on what is driving long-term value in the business, and like how to sort of look at these metrics in a holistic way and not just focus entirely on bottom of funnel return on ad
Right.
spend, because it's really easy to measure return on ad spend there. You mentioned incrementality. Of course, that's a question as well. But still, if the incentives are centered around that bottom of funnel return on ad spend,
Yeah.
that can cause all sorts of problems, right? And so when we're going back to kind of, thinking about different scenario planning and thinking about what would you do to reduce budget, and kind of always be thinking about those types of dynamics and understanding your program better. Part of that is also making sure that the organization itself understands how marketing is working, and that can be one of the most difficult things in marketing.
Yeah.
Really is to make sure that the executive team understands what's happening.
100%.
I think one thing too that I want to ask is like, oftentimes I think when budget cuts happen, it's because not often, but occasionally it's market factors, right? Like something's going on in the economy, or our buyers have less disposable income, or that can happen. And so I do wonder from a messaging perspective if that changes, right? It doesn't seem insensitive to say, we know you're buying less because you have less, and now we're going to go harder and bottom of funnel spend more. Like it almost, from a messaging sense, I wonder, makes more sense to keep more of your top of funnel because it's less pushy.
It all depends on the type of like product or service that you're trying to sell to, right? Like if you're selling $10 widgets, like you can probably afford to be more focused in the middle of funnel and bottom of funnel in that situation, because you can still drive a lot of quick, snappy purchases. But higher consideration purchases, where you want to get in someone's consideration set early in their journey, that's where I think you can start to do damage to that brand over the long term. And there is that kind of perception that I think people may pick up on, where if you see a brand who is still present in an economic downturn and is doing big TV buys, billboards, whatever it may be, that's almost a sign of resiliency and a sign of strength in that brand continuing to advertise when people know that there is a downturn in the economy. So that can have some latent factors too, maybe on how users perceive the brand as someone that is reliable and is going to be around like no matter what. Now, it's easier said than done, of course. Like budget isn't infinite, especially in an economic downturn. But that's where some of those harder calls need to happen, and the marketing team is generally the first port of call for budget cuts. Is what I have seen in my career, and I don't necessarily think that's always the best reaction. It's the easiest place, I think, to just reduce spend quite quickly, but it can have some long-term implications that I think teams aren't necessarily always aware of.
Oh yeah, you can make your quarter real quick
Mm-hmm.
by cutting the digital advertising budget, right?
Yeah.
This is one of the reasons why that investment in understanding the dynamics of your advertising program and educating your organization and your internal teams, that investment upfront now, like you should be doing that now and always. I think that just pays so many dividends, because when you do find yourself in a situation where things are tougher, how, like you've already done the scenario planning, you've already understood the dynamics. Hopefully you've implemented some technology, right? So like marketing mix modeling, MMM, that's actually a really good way of reducing budget in a really responsible way, because you can do scenario planning with those models. You can understand sort of what the optimal output would be at different spend levels. And that optimal output in a lot of cases is sort of counterintuitive, right? If you were to just look at your attribution reports, you tend to look at what's performing best and let's keep spending there, and let's cut things that aren't spending all that well. But when you start to get into an actual advertising program that's optimized by an algorithm, then you get these counterintuitive results, but you're going to get better business results from those different scenarios, right? And so investing in some of that technology also helps, but you don't have to go down the road of MMM. Like if your marketing team doesn't have the budget to be spending 150 grand a year on MMM, then you don't actually need to do that. You can be tweaking your sort of budget on a regular basis throughout the year to better understand those dynamics and be ready when you do need to make a switch.
Yeah, it's funny. Like, I feel like in this episode, we're harping back to a bunch of other episodes we've done talking about like how do we educate exec teams and measurement and everything. And it's an interesting kind of like case study on, in a real world scenario, like why it's important to keep all those things top of mind, because it's almost like you're building your war chest of information that becomes really important when you do need to bring out those tools to try and understand how to best respond in these situations. Because the way I see it is that there's kind of like two sides to the coin here. You've got like the reactive element to any of these budget cuts, where there is a response to these broader market conditions that we don't have control over necessarily, i.e. big interest rate shifts, inflation, user sentiment changes, product market fit change, competitor changes. All of those things are macro and we don't have a lot of control. But then on the flip side, you've got the proactive element of like really focusing on making sure we've got all these elements buttoned up before any of that happens, and doing these scenario plans you're talking about, Eric, and kind of having everything ready just in case. And that can have benefits for your current program too. It's not like you're just preparing for this scenario that may happen in the future. You can implement a lot of those benefits within your program now. Like, you don't necessarily have to wait. Yeah, there's almost like a mindset of like preparing for the worst somewhat, but through that there are a bunch of other side benefits that come from that process. The thing that jumps out to me the most, though, is like it comes back to incentives, right? Like how teams get measured, or marketing teams get measured, is how they will produce output. If it's around ROAS, it will be ROAS that they produce. If it's around page views, they will produce page views. Not that that's necessarily like the best way to go about it, but I think I don't want to open up that debate.
Please don't do that.
Yeah. But I think there's a very kind of clear conversation there. As leaders in like a marketing organization, it's important to set the right goalposts, especially in these moments, so that teams feel comfortable responding in the ways that might not be the way that they've measured success in the past. So I think that's a really interesting point.
I want to know, how often should marketing teams then be doing these worst case scenarios? Like, when should you update your big binder of break in case of emergency documents?
Break glass in case of emergency.
Exactly.
Yeah. So, I mean, let's be clear. Like, you don't have to run the actual scenario, right? So, like, we're not necessarily saying like, hey, cut your budget by 50% for a month and see what happens. Because if you do, you're probably going to miss your quarter, right? And that's going to be a problem. And justifying that to the exec team is maybe a problem. But understanding, so what we're talking about is understanding the dynamics of your advertising program, so that when those scenarios come up, then you're ready to respond to them, right? And so that could be a geo test, that could be just sort of regular fluctuations to the budget level within various different channels in your advertising program, those types of things. All of that can be analyzed by a good analyst to find the optimal budget mix at different spend levels. It can be more sophisticated teams can plug it into a marketing mix model, those types of things as well, right? And so it's less about running the scenario and actually reducing your budget by 50%, and more about just tweaking the budget as you go, trying to understand, how you might have to change the offer, or how you might have to change your advertising program in those various scenarios where you may have to cut budget. Because I would say that most marketing teams have to cut budget significantly at some point, right? So being prepared for that is really ideal. The other thing I was going to say too, though, is we're talking a lot about proactivity. Like, what about the teams that are stuck, right, and haven't done this? It's easy to say, hey, be proactive and be prepared 6 months before this happens. But unfortunately, some marketing teams are in a place where they do have to reduce budget to meet finance goals or something like that. The number one thing that springs to mind for me in that scenario, if you're caught off guard and you have to reduce your marketing budget suddenly, is to turn it into an actual test, to try to get something positive out of it. So run a geo test. So if you need to cut budget by 50%, you could actually turn off your entire program in parts of the country and better understand the true incremental impact of your entire program. That gives you more ammunition to go back to your finance team and say, hey, look, like, this is the actual impact that we had in these various different markets where we turned off the advertising. And so you can better justify sort of what the result is from your advertising. If it's a deeper cut that needs to be made, I mean, you can run different scenarios there, but turning it into some kind of test where you understand incrementality at least gets you some value out of that situation, as opposed to just sort of, in a blanket sense, kind of turning things off across the entire country or whatever your geo target is.
Eric, I love that.
So you actually stole my question.
Oh,
I want to get realistic now. Let's say we tell you, all right, we're cutting budgets effective now. You've got no plan, like you've got no anything. Eric, you just answered this question, but Phil, what are you cutting first if you have to cut something and it's not about optimizing, it's not about proactivity?
Totally. I mean, I think I go back to like a two-stage process, and I kind of alluded to this a little earlier in the episode, but the first thing to look at is, well, that bottom-up approach. Like, what are those channels that are maybe overperforming from a platform reported ROAS standpoint that look great on a report, but are maybe not actually driving business results? So starting from the bottom up, what evidence do you have, or what evidence may have you collected around those tactics that would be the first areas to cut? The second stage would be kind of alluding to Eric's point, which I loved, around how are you setting this up as a test? How can you learn something from this? Because it's not often that you get a chance to test something so, I will say, dramatic, because it can be quite dramatic, these budget changes. So are there ways to really try and learn something around this? And how could you slice and dice this test into the key hypotheses that you want to try and learn? So Eric's example he just shared was like, a 2-cell test, like turn everything off in one area of the country, keep it on in another. But could you turn that into a 3 or 4-cell test where you're doing different treatments in different cells and saying, well, if I cut my meta spend completely from this market and it's a major channel for us, what happens? If I cut our entire marketing spend from this market, what happens? And then you can really start to build a picture of, well, not just is my marketing spend working, but which channels within my marketing spend are really having this outsized impact. Because what I've seen when we've gone to clients and gone and said, well, let's test this pretty major channel for you and turn it off in these markets, there's generally a kind of like gasp of, well, like that's risky. Like that's going to put the quarter at risk, or put our numbers for the week at risk, or even day. So it's a good opportunity to, I think, test some of those bigger hypotheses that would otherwise be a little too uncomfortable to test in a normal situation. Eric, any thoughts on that? I'm curious to get your take.
I'm in total agreement.
Great podcast.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, we're just gonna agree with each other for the next hour. I think the sort of, to play devil's advocate, I suppose, a little bit here. Marketing teams do run into the situation where even when budget needs to be reduced, there's pushback against turning advertising completely off in certain areas of the country as well, right? And so this is where things kind of get a little bit trickier. Yes, that is an opportunity, and I even started this train of thought too, in that, like, finding a way to test it is really important. But in some cases, you're also not going to be able to test it. And that's when there are some other tools. There's some econometrics tools. There's a technique that Google came out with a package that can do causal impact, and that might also be able to give you a directional picture of what the effect was of just reducing your budget, even though you're keeping it even across the entire country, right? And so being able to run some of these types of tests, just on observational data can be really helpful as well. And that can at least get you some information out of a bad situation of having to reduce budget. The other thing that we haven't talked about too, though, is offer, right? And so I think that's a big lever that marketing teams can pull. Just reducing budgets is not the only lever that you can pull. If you have to sort of reduce the amount of marketing spend, yes, you can reduce the actual advertising spend budget. But at the same time, how do you sort of maintain the kind of growth in the business or something like that? Is there some short-term change that you can make to the offer to maybe bring new customers into the business during that period of time, or maintain new customer acquisition, et cetera, during this downturn in your budget kind of thing, right? It really kind of depends on, I think, how long that budget reduction is going to be. If your finance team has said, hey, look, we need to hit our numbers this quarter, we need to reduce the budget for 3 weeks. That's a very different scenario than saying, hey, we're actually cutting the remainder of the annual budget here by 50%. And so that this is going to last through the new year. That's a completely different scenario, and you have to kind of approach that differently, right? And so that's a harder scenario. And that's when I think that running these geo tests and really understanding sort of where the incremental value of your marketing program is going to be so important, because you're going to have to hunker down for 6 months, right? Whereas if it's 3 weeks, maybe you can reduce budget, change the offer a little bit, and continue to push new user acquisition through the system during that period of time.
No, I love that. And we've been talking a lot in this episode around, how do we move spend around between channels, but there is a whole layer beneath that around what are you doing within accounts, like within actual campaigns or ad groups or ad sets, keywords, ads, etc. It's also a great opportunity to go and do a deep audit on your campaigns. Are there keywords that are just wasting spend that you are kind of comfortable with that because you want it to be in a growth mindset, but now that the mindset has shifted, maybe that keyword should be paused, and it's taking up 10% of your search budget, just as an example. So I think there's a whole nother layer there to not just thinking about how do we macro move budget around within the program, but also a more micro level of, well, how are the campaigns actually working for the business? And that extends to offer, like you just mentioned, Derek, but also things like landing pages. If you're thinking about putting users onto the website and you want to make sure that they're converting as best they can, that traffic's expensive. How could you make sure that traffic is as likely as possible to convert and isn't finding problems with your cart or problems with your landing page? Don't forget about some of that side of things too, because if market sentiment is shifting and people are more conscious of, let's say, their expenses, inflation's high at the moment, there's somewhat of that feeling in the marketplace. Talk to the value of your product and the offer that might be in place versus, let's say, it's free shipping, because free shipping, everyone does free shipping these days. Really talk about the value that your product brings and how it will make that person's life better, just as an example. So I think there's a whole extra layer there that we could talk about when it comes to budget reductions, not just being at a channel level, but also at a micro level too.
I think too, Phil, something you're bringing up that we talk about a lot here, and I think is always worth noting, is how you're talking to other departments. So I work a lot with the creative team, and to your point, if there are macro market changes at play, we're going to change the copy up, right? We should be changing the copy up. We should be changing the creative up, things like that. And so how are you talking to your creative department? How are you talking to your organic team to see, to your point, what you can be doing with your email list if you've got a good one? Like, how are
Yeah,
you working with other departments to see how you can like weather the storm together?
100%.
And then one other thing that I want to bring up is from an agency perspective. So I think like one of the big risks that we often encounter is that we get surprised from our clients, because I think there's this maybe mentality on the client side that, agencies only want big budgets, or we're greedy, or we're this, we're that. And we've seen so many clients and so many companies and industries and market conditions, and we really just want to help. And so the sooner you can tell us what may or may not happen, the faster we can help you and more proactively plan, right? Like if you have to cut budget, chat with us and see if there's any like thinking or strategy you can get out of us, right? Because we've seen a lot of it before.
Yeah, I think like it's got to be a collaborative process, and every situation is different. There will be some times where it's like we need to reduce budget starting tomorrow, and like that's a very different scenario than next quarter your budget has been reduced and you've got a month to figure out what to do. Like those are two very different scenarios on how your marketing team, be it an agency or in house, needs to interact with your kind of finance team, or the CMO or whomever it may be, to try and adjust that program. Because yes, we've been saying on this episode, like we could do all these tests and all of these really interesting things as a result of this budget change. If the budget needs to be reduced tomorrow, I don't think it's practical or wise to set up all these tests in such a short period of time without doing the appropriate planning and statistical analysis to figure out, well, what that test needs to look like for it to produce a statistically significant result. So I think every one of these situations is different, and there's going to be different perspectives on kind of what should happen. But if that homework has been done, like a quarterly business review is kind of a great mechanism for this, because it's a moment to like step back and look at the program more holistically around what's working and what's not, without getting too distracted by weekly, daily, or even monthly results. So if you've got a good process in around QBRs and having the correct information and talking points in those, especially when it comes to media mix, then I think teams should be in a good place to be able to respond well in these specific moments. So yeah, that would be my, I guess, like summary of what you just mentioned, Santana, where like if there's been that proactivity in QBRs, then my hope would be that the response would be less of a knee-jerk reaction and more of a like, we have the data to back up our decisions and we feel confident in what we're taking forwards.
I do want to say something really quickly, just in terms of like the setting up tests quickly and sort of what we would call sort of pre-test analysis, right? So like understanding like, how many geos you would have to turn off or something like that in order to make a test successful and those types of things. If you do have to reduce budget tomorrow, you can kind of skip some of those steps, I think, right? And the reality is, like, if you don't get a significant result from turning off 4 or 5 states in a particular campaign or something like that because you had to reduce budget super quick, so be it, right? At least you've added more dynamics to the results that you have, which is always a good thing. So what we always encourage is having some kind of variance in your budget, variance in the ways that every channel is sort of being deployed, right? And so when you're reducing budget, if you just drop your daily budgets or something like that, that is a form of variance. But also turning off certain states within your your geo targeting or something like that can also be introducing this variance. And looking back at that, so when you do have time to actually take a beat and sort of analyze the results, you can look back at that at that data, and you can actually try to extract more information out of it, right? So I think that in an urgent situation where you do have to drop budgets suddenly, it is still beneficial to think about, hey, how could I do this in a way that could actually give me more information in the future, even if it's not run through a data scientist and sort of proper in all of the statistical ways. You've introduced some new type of variance, which can be analyzed in the future. Hopefully there's some kind of inference there. If there isn't, so be it, right? Like, you've still reduced budget, and you're no further behind than what you would have been.
I'm going to quote Eric Sloan here with an Ericism. It's almost like the perfection could be the enemy of good in that moment, right? And like,
that's certainly not my quote.
No, but like, you say this all the time, and like, I appreciate that where it comes from, and the mindset is totally valid, Eric. Like, I appreciate you pushing back on that one, because I think you could get in that mindset of like trying to set everything up kind of perfectly, but in that moment you're kind of in wartime, if you will. Like, there needs to be that willingness to like maybe have a few looser ends or more ragged edges than you might have in like a well-oiled machine that you'd operate in a normal quarter. So yeah, I think some flexibility there makes a ton of sense. So I really appreciate that perspective.
So let's dig into the mess then, because I love that. I also say it often, right? Like, don't let the optimal get in the way of the necessary. And like, so let's talk about the necessary. Let's talk about a bit of mess. So what are some risks that you've seen in budget cuts? Or I'll pose it a different way and say, what are some bad fire sale ways to do a budget cut?
Focus on brand and retargeting. That would be where I've seen things generally fall on their face a little. Is branded search is the only channel that's active, and some retargeting, again, produces great ROAS at a face value, but when you dive deeper, is it really providing that much value? We've spoken at length about that on this podcast, as is the industry at the moment. There's this like awakening that's happening around incrementality, but that's the biggest risk I would see is, as we've said, if the incentives are incorrect and we're focused on platform ROAS, retargeting and branded search look mighty attractive when you're in a budget cut scenario, but that damages things long term, in my opinion. So that would be the biggest risk and watch out, is just, are your incentives correct, and are you on a race to only focus on really bottom of funnel capturing intent?
The only thing I would say here, because we've sort of talked around a bunch of the risks here, is that it really comes down to two things. So you're either cutting out all of the growth from your advertising program, so you're reducing budget in all of the places that is actually going to drive business growth. That's a huge problem, right? And so that's what you're saying, Phil, is essentially you're focusing on the bottom of the funnel, branded search, retargeting, etc. And so you're cutting out everywhere that is actually producing new customer acquisition, right? So there's that, and not learning anything. That would be my second one, right? And so like you're not taking the opportunity to actually learn something from the budget reductions. If you're not doing both of those things, then that's a huge risk. And you should always sort of see every change, every dynamic change to your program as a way to learn something, right? And so if you're changing a creative campaign, you can learn something, right? These are more obvious. If we're introducing a new channel, we can learn something. That's obvious too. But reducing budget, that's also a way of learning something new about your advertising program and the dynamics there.
I love that.
And so, are there any tools, tactics? I don't want to talk about methodologies. I think tools and tactics, because we've talked so much about testing already. What are some tools and tactics to help marketers do more with less?
I think we've been talking quite a bit about this, but marketing mix modeling is definitely a more sophisticated way. There's a lot of buzz in the industry right now about MMM. That's one way of better understanding the dynamics of your advertising program. It can be too expensive for a lot of teams, though, right? It's in the six figures typically. You can run an open source version. There's a number of open source versions of MMM. There's Robin from Meta. There's lightweight MMM. Google just came out with another open source version as well. There's PyMC Marketing is also open source. But actually being able to run these models is the easy part. Being able to interpret them is the more difficult part. And there's a lot of teams out there that just don't have the resources to do that. And so that might be detrimental, right? And so, but MMM would be kind of one of the best ways to run scenario planning. Try to understand through a future lens, sort of like if we change our budget in these various different ways, what's going to happen to the response variable, which is typically revenue or pipeline or some kind of outcome. Failing that, you can sort of take a step back and there's a lot of ways of sort of analyzing your existing marketing data that you've been collecting just by running digital advertising. You're collecting data every single day. There's a lot of ways of analyzing that data and being able to optimize the budget within the data that you do have, right? And so it doesn't have to be MMM. You have to make more judgment calls and you have to sort of deal with more ambiguity when you don't use a tool. But at the same time, analyzing that data and sort of understanding, hey, what happens when we introduce new budget? Are we getting the same type of return? What is the marginal return? These types of things is really important to understand and sort of integrate into your understanding. There are various different attribution tools that may help with that. But one thing I would say is to be careful about relying too much on something like multi-touch attribution. It's not causal in any way. It's not actually telling you what is driving new revenue. It's just telling you what channels are associated with new revenue. And so going back to the question of risks, I think that MTA, multi-touch attribution, is one of those big risks. Relying too heavily on one of those tools can actually be detrimental to the entire system. So anyways, there's lots of tools. I think one of the important things to remember, though, is that you can't solve large budget changes or growth in your business or any of those things with technology, right? A tool is not going to solve all of the problems. You can use these tools to inform your decision making, but you still have to make judgment calls along the way.
I almost wonder if there's a case to like get a little bit more nervous about tools in a budget cut, because sometimes you almost feel like this could be, it looks like this a glass of water in the desert, right? And those tools want you to believe that, but there's not really a single source of truth, as we often discuss in technology. And I find a lot of those B2B softwares really want you to believe that they're the solve to all your problems.
Yes. No, I'd agree with that. And I don't necessarily have anything, to add on to what Eric said, aside from just saying that like doing more with less is somewhat of a function of, CPC and conversion rate. How could you make either your traffic that you're putting into your paid program be more effective, and then how are you converting on that traffic? And we've spoken a lot in this episode on like the former of like how are we really focusing on driving more kind of traffic effectiveness from a paid perspective, but how are we converting it? Where are you landing it? What's that experience looking like on the website? Is that as buttoned up as it could be? Because no matter when we're going through this budget scenario, paid is expensive. When we're paying, sometimes $15, $20, $30 a click, like make sure that is most likely to convert as possible. So I think there's a whole element there that we haven't spoken about too much today, but that shouldn't be forgotten in all of this, and really focusing on CRO throughout any of these budget cuts is extremely important too, and shouldn't be overlooked.
The reality is teams get sloppy when things are good. When you have tons of budget, when you're hitting your numbers every single month, all that kind of stuff, there's all this sort of noise or waste that's created in the program. And then when budget is reduced, you have to go through and clean all of that out. Yeah. Hopefully you're sort of refining as you go. But if you're not, you're taking on debt, and that debt comes due when the budget gets cut. And so, hopefully teams are proactive. If you're not, then typically there's a lot of places to cut and a lot of ways to learn from those cuts.
There's some lumps under the rug that need to be ironed out oftentimes.
Yeah.
What did Maddie say last episode? It was a good marketer is a skeptical one.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, can we get that on shirts?
Yeah, I would love that. Coffee mugs.
Brilliant.
This might be my favorite future projection question we've done, which is, what tactic do you think we'll look back on as a waste of money, time, or effort?
Ooh, that's a juicy one. Eric, do you want to go first?
I'm going to be controversial here and say search advertising. I think that most brands overinvest in search advertising. It's absolutely an incredible tool to capture intent that's in the market. It's absolutely an incredible tool to get in front of people who are in markets to make a purchase in relatively short order. But a lot of marketing teams have pushed it way too hard. They are expecting sort of consideration or even awareness level sort of advertising out of search advertising. And that's just not what it's used for. And I think that in a lot of cases, it gets pushed beyond the point where it should be a tool within your marketing program. Absolutely. Search advertising belongs in the vast majority of marketing programs. And I'm talking about non-brand search primarily. Branded search, is a discussion for almost every single brand. But yeah, search advertising is very useful, but I think it gets pushed way too hard in 2024. And I think that a lot of brands need to reevaluate how much they're investing there and whether or not those dollars would be better spent in some other channel that can actually drive growth and drive more reach in the market.
Interesting perspective, Eric.
I saw some smirks when I said search advertising. So
No, just you have a hate on for branded search a little bit, and we all know it.
I'm not even talking about branded search here. So I'm actually specifically talking about non-brand. I think that most modern marketers would agree that branded search is something that should be questioned heavily, right? And so that's nothing new. I don't think that's a controversial opinion, but I think that a lot of brands are actually over investing heavily in non-brand search.
It's a really interesting take, and you do see search being a huge portion of a lot of brands' budgets, primarily because it's easy to measure. It's very clear that there's a clear fit between someone who's searching for my product or service and I'm showing an ad to them. It's a lot more simple to understand than something like Meta or programmatic TV or whatever it could be. It's a lot more simple as a mechanism to put an ad in front of that person. But I do somewhat agree that there's probably some overinvestment there. I would disagree it's maybe as dramatic as you mentioned, Eric. So that's where I will offer a different opinion. But I do think in general the industry is kind of having this awakening right now. That maybe we've not been measuring things correctly for a few years. And we need to be going back to really focusing on the fundamentals of what is the message we're putting out there? What is that correct media mix that really can help understand where are we reaching our right user at the right time with the right message? So I think the question for me was less so what's the tactic that we'll be going back and looking at as a waste of time, money, and effort. I would say it's more a mindset that we'll look back on and be like, that was kind of strange that we looked at things in that way for a number of years and weren't really thinking about questioning the ad channels that much in terms of what they are actually producing from a results perspective. So that's what I think we'll look back on is more generally a mindset versus a specific channel that was necessarily a waste. And waste is a strong word. We're always learning something, right? It's not like we just lit that money on fire. There's often value from that in some way or the other, from learnings or from actual conversions. But yeah, it's an interesting thought exercise, I think.
Mine's creative. I think we have too much overlap between brand creative and performance creative. I think a lot of companies spend a lot of money on their ads and then kind of think of the creative as an afterthought of a brand team, and brand teams do an incredible job with that brand creative, but performance creative is a different animal. And I think especially in a time when attribution is not as strong as it used to be, I think that we need to start treating performance creative as a separate and important thing from brand. That's my hot take coming from traditional agency backgrounds is too often brand creative departments get assignments from performance with no performance knowledge. And I just don't, I think that's such a waste of money, but that's just my hot take.
It's a good one.
I like that. Yeah.
Okay, friends. Well, thank you so much. This was a spicy episode. Thanks for listening. This has been The Hypothesis. Thank you so much for tuning in. For show notes or to get in touch, find us at thehypothesisshow.com or at Thrive Digital, both linked for you in our description box. And if you liked today's episode, we'd love if you'd rate and review wherever you're listening or watching. Thanks.